Okay, welcome to this Alexanderi Visiting Fellows Research Seminar. My name is Anna-Liisa Heusala. I will be hosting this seminar today. We have the great pleasure of having Palihar Sanghera from University of Kent as our visiting researcher and lecturer today. He is a senior lecturer who in sociology, whose main interests are political economy, social theory, and ethics. And he's been currently writing 2 research projects, or has already maybe finished them. One is a global capitalism and social movements in Central Asia with Dr. Elmira Statulbaldieva, and social justice and philanthropy in the UK with Dr. Kate Bradley. So without any further ado, I give you the floor.
Firstly, I want to thank Anna for the invitation at the Alexanderi Institute, but also to Anna-Liisa and Serkan for being wonderful academic hosts. And I know it's been a kind of an extra tour on you, but thank you for being kind enough to agree to do this. I also just want to kind of just say my thanks to colleagues at the Institute for their warm welcome. It really has been a joy just to talk to colleagues, just, whilst in the kitchenette, just, talk about their research and seeing what they're doing. So really just a shout out to the wonderful colleagues at the Institute. I'm presenting this presentation, but it should be made clear at the beginning that this is very much a joint research and work with Almira Statulbaldieva. So everything that I'm presenting here is jointly produced, and we have Almira there. I should also say, of course, that any omissions and errors are solely mine. So do bear with me if errors are produced during the presentation. As you can see, the title has somewhat changed from the advertised program. It's Why Capitalism Matters for Collective Action, Social Struggle of Recognition, Redistribution, and Representation in Central Asia. Very much, the themes are still very much the same as that in the abstract. Just kind of the emphasis and the overall packaging has been slightly altered in light of reflection and further analysis. And this is very much, I should say, this is very much a work in progress. So we would welcome your comments on where you think we have omitted things, or where we think we should be making our points stronger. In terms of what we're going to do in the presentation, it's really just 3 key points that I want to make here. Firstly, is to bringing back capitalism into the analysis of social movements in Central Asia, to ask colleagues to engage social movement literature with critical political economy. All too often we see the analysis of capitalism missing in social movement literature. So this is very much an attempt to bringing capitalism back into the analysis that all too often had disappeared. Furthermore, it's during the presentation to argue that social movements engage in a range of issues that are all important. There are issues around cultural recognition, economic redistribution, and political representation. These aren't either or issues, they're all together. And as you will see during the presentation, social movements do engage with all these issues in one form or another. And finally, to examine how social movements, organizations, activists seek either to support the existing neoliberal hegemony in Central Asia, or seek to resist it. Now, when it comes to the literature on social movements in Central Asia, and I suspect certainly wider as well, in Eurasia as well, what we find that there are three dominant approaches to looking at protests and activism. And I'll just briefly highlight three of them for you here. Firstly, what's sometimes called frame theory by Edward Schatz. Edward Schatz has used frame theory in his recent work last year called The Slow Anti-Americanism, in which he discusses the US as a meta frame, a meta narrative, which then gets mobilized, used by various organizations, social forces, to promote their causes. So human rights movements use democracy and freedom and human rights, whereas Ismailist conservative groups use ideas around hypocrisy and conspiracy theory about the United States, the anti-American opinions. The other key approach within the literature is referred to as social resource mobilization theory. And a key proponent of this had been Scott Radnitz, whose work almost 10 years ago, the weapons of the wealthy, was a considerable impact on the studies of protest and activism. And there he argues that independent elites tend to manipulate the masses for their own ends. It's a version of client-patron relationships in which the power is firmly within the patron. And arguably, elites have instrumentalized cultural wars for their political expediency and power struggles. And then the third approach is what's sometimes referred to as the critical opportunity structure approach. And here, there's no one kind of particular person, they're all engaging in one form or another. McGillinchy in some form, Liber and Waters all engage in this form of looking at the nature of political regimes and how authoritarian regimes tend to hinder progressive activism, or even in the case of what McGillinchy writes, how competitive political structures encourages uncivil society. And here, civil societies are often characterized in binary terms: open and closed, liberal and illiberal, progressive and conservative. But what's common, what comes out in this kind of literature and these various approaches is what Jeff Goodwin calls the strange disappearance of capitalism in social movement. There's very little discussion on the effects of capitalism on social movement. There's just very little there. It just gets kind of pushed to the side. And if it does occur, it's only marginal effect, nothing significant. And last year, the Oxford Society in DC undertook a study of looking at protests in Central Asia between 2018 and 20, and they used media reports to track the various kinds of protests that occurred in Central Asia. Here, I'll just give just for Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, because that's the nature, that's the particular study that Amir and I are focusing on. These two particular countries. So they do go to about Uzbekistan and Tajikistan as well, but I'm not going to focus on that. And what they do is they categorize protests under particular categories. So it's around human rights, justice, welfare, COVID, China, and in doing so, what comes out is that these social struggles, these protests, are treated as if they're discrete or disconnected instance of protest. That there's no connection between them. They're just individualized, discrete events that occur on their own. And when explanations are provided divided. Often they draw on geopolitics. So in one of their works, they talk about xenophobia, that the reason why there's some degree of protest in these countries because of anti-Chinese sentiments. But there's also others around Russia, and of course we've seen earlier around America. So explanations are not just only about geopolitics. Elitism comes to the fore as well as the idea of authoritarian regimes. But I suppose what we want to argue here is that social studies should engage with critical political economy to better grasp the intensity, the variety, and the timing of social movements. And colleagues, I would invite you to inquire. Let's just inquire if capitalism is not somehow not responsible for generating these protests, or too often in the field, in the area of studies, but also generally in the literature on social movements. It's almost a priori as if capitalism is not responsible for producing these protests. But surely we should be asking the question in the first place, rather than dismissing it a priori. And this is something that Anna and I did in our book, Roger, Capitalism and Its Discontent. We tried to explore the effects of a particular kind of capitalism around rentier extraction and how this had particular effects on protest. And what we argued was that there were grassroots movements that responded to a liberal or liberalizing form of capitalism, which was based around rent extraction, financial rent, interest, land rent, natural resource rent, all these forms of rent extraction, which had a disempowering effect on the population. So what we explained in the book was how the neoliberal movement had commodified money, land, and labor that unjustly enriched the elites and the investor class, but at the expense of causing disempowerment, dispossession, and misery on the rest of the population. And it was as a result of this kind of social suffering that we argued that there was a kind of Planian double movement in which grassroots movements, activism emerged around anti-debt, informal settlements, affordable housing, the environment, and trade union and labor rights. And if at the start of and another example of this kind of effects of capitalism and on activism can be discerned at the beginning of this year, when in January 22 we saw protests in Kazakhstan as a result of the rich trying to appropriate rent, land, or value grabbing by liberalizing fuel prices. And then we saw a response by the state to oppress the working class protests that occurred in response to this price hike that occurred. So clearly, capitalism has implications, and the question is that we need to then examine this in a much more rigorous way. So, colleagues, let's just sort of remind ourselves why capitalism matters. I'm sure this is almost like telling grannies how to suck eggs, and I'm sure we all know why capitalism matters, but it's probably just worth reminding ourselves why it matters. So firstly, of course, and then why it matters for collective action in particular. Firstly, capitalist institutions are a source of target, or a source or target of popular grievances, whether it be around high interest rates, labor disputes, or land grabs by the rich. It is a source by which the rest of the population seek some sort of address of some sort. Capitalism shapes collective identities and solidarities. Clearly, middle class identities and working class identities emerge as a result of capitalism. And there's a whole literature in sociology about identity formations as a result of capitalism. In particular, I would refer you to the works of Bordosian scholars around habitus, for instance, how it shapes particular tastes, identities, and concerns. And but I think furthermore, I think it's that the expansion of the wage labor arguably had an impact on feminism and LGBT, because as a result of the employment and achieving a degree of independence from family relations, it then empowered groups to advocate for their particular recognition, their rights. Thirdly, the capitalist systems can distribute power, resources unevenly to different classes and class factions. Again, I would invite you to consider the work of Bourdieu and the different forms of capital, economic, cultural, social, and how different parts of society are able to achieve their concerns, their goals, aspirations over others. And so class fragmentation, class stratification emerge, in which one group are able to achieve better living standards than others. Capitalist institutions can facilitate and inhibit specific groups' alliances based on common interests. Clearly, here the state plays a key role, enabling a degree of social cohesion over certain alliances, and or can bring about forms of repression and fragmentation. Moreover, fifthly, class struggles can occur within movements, disagreements about the importance of a particular kind of strategy or aims, something that we pointed out in our book, Frontier Capitalism and Its Discontent, how middle class movements were often at odds with working class movements within over similar issues around debt, amnesty, or about housing issues. And I think finally, and I think this is key here, is how ideologies and cultural assumptions linked to capitalism can shape movement strategies and demands. Again, colleagues, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Gramsci here, and how justification and legitimation plays a key role in legitimizing and achieving consent within civil society. So in terms of our research that we conducted, Amir and I conducted over the summer, so we focused very much on looking at the nature of social movements in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. It was a qualitative research, and this involved 15 in-depth interviews in Astana, Almaty, Bishkek, and Osh. Each interview lasted around 2.5 hours. The sample, with the purpose of sampling, so it wasn't a representative sampling, we briefly target groups to reflect a wide range of activism across issues and that were emerging in both countries. And it consisted of social activists, formal and informal, NGO directors, trade union officials, business leaders, international donors, as well as a couple of experts. Many of the participants were high-profile figures, people in the media, or were well known. And the themes of the interviews was very much trying to ascertain the activist aims, their demands, their concerns, their strategy for mobilization and their activism, and their understanding of society, but also what their vision of a good society looked like. So a broad set of issues, but very much focusing around what it is what is it that they were concerned by, what did they want to achieve, and how and why did all these things matter to them. And this is a kind of a more or less a summary, I think, of what we found as a result of our interviews. When I say here, when I use the word movements here, I'm using the movement here not to refer to an organization as such, but as a metaphor for social change. Right? So here, the forms of social movement, the movement refers to a metaphor for direction of change. In which direction is change occurring? And we argue that we can identify 4 types of social movement, i.e. social change in particular directions. Now, in terms of what activists were trying to achieve, they were broadly around the 3 issues that I outlined at the beginning: cultural recognition, economic redistribution, and political representation. And what we found was that all these things mattered, but some mattered more than others. Some had greater priority and significance than other claims. And the forms of their politics either took a strong form or a weak form, depending on what it is that they were trying to change. So if I can just go through a couple of boxes for you here. So when I talk about here, sorry, how did that happen there?
It's a touch screen.
Oh, it's a touch screen. Oh, okay. Very sensitive. Okay, there we go. This is the kind of technology we don't have in Kent. Okay, so the strong form of recognition there doesn't mean that the activists were felt extremely intense or were passionate or were very active. No, what it means is that the activists sought to bring about change to patriarchal and cultural structures. LGBT feminists would be good examples of those kinds of activists who sought to bring about changes to existing cultural, social structures and norms and values to bring about greater gender, sexual equality, as well as protection of the environment. Those who were engaged in weak form of recognition were more or less trying to maintain the existing cultural, social hierarchies and norms. So they weren't trying to reform or change the existing structures. And then when we go to the redistribution, those that were engaged in weak form of redistribution were largely supporting the existing neoliberal economic system. The economic system of minimum welfare state, privatization, market economy, and weak labor rights and trade unions. That's to be contrasted with the strong form of redistribution, who sought to amend the economic system towards their constituents, either asking for greater welfare support or pension rights, or bringing about a change in property rights to ensure well-being for the whole society. So that explains the forms of recognition, largely around cultural patriarchy issues, redistribution around economic system. And depending on their aims and their strategies, they were either engaged in strong form or weak form. And what we found is that you could then see map them according to this kind of matrix as well. It's worth also saying here, I think, that almost all activists, or most of the activists, supported a strong form of critical representation, which would make sense, of course, because they were engaged in representation. So it would be odd if they wanted weak form of representation. And what we found is that a particular class of people populated the particular boxes. So there was a tendency for in the neoliberal progressive movement, for middle classes to be in that sector, in that box, and middle class and working class in the reformist defensive movement. I'm going to go through each of these boxes. So I know this sounds broad and very abstract. So hopefully, by going through some case studies, you'll get a better feel for what these boxes are like. So let me give you the first case study here, which is that of an LGBT movement in Almaty. There were many movements, LGBT movements, that we spoke to, and this was a particularly famous one. It started out initially as a Friday gathering to provide LGBT communities with safe spaces for them to meet and provide support to each other. It then moved towards a strategy of greater visibility and presence. As a deal of notes, he said in that quote there, we want to reach a point where LGBT is normalized. So trying to bring about a change to the cultural norms and structures of society. And its vision of a good society was one in which the state is minimal and where groups like LGBT and others were able to have formal and institutionalized inclusivity. And the alliances that they developed were largely with other urban middle-class liberal initiatives. Now, he provides a very interesting quote where he describes how the kind of concerns that he has is largely at odds with the working class concerns around debt, housing, and precarity. And he gives this quote where he says, I would never go to a rally that demands debt amnesty. So as I pointed out already, debt is a huge issue in Central Asia because of the power of the banks to extract rent through high interest rates. And this has been an issue for most people in the region. So he said, I'll never go to a rally that demands debt amnesty. These are people like those people that attend these rallies, like mothers' movements, working class groups, who don't want institutional change. They just come and say, we want more money. And that's it. We don't cross paths with them, he says. You know, we're different. LGBT, his group is different from that group. Their welfare is something I can sympathize with, but my welfare is not their concern. So just this sense of divide between the different groups. And when we look at the other organizations, other activists in this kind of broad category of neoliberal progressive movement, what we find is that they share certain characteristics. Firstly, is that they want to bring about a change to the existing cultural institutions and norms to ensure greater gender and sexual equality and to protect the environment. That's, I think, that's the progressive part, right? The progressive part of the movement, of that social change. But here comes the neoliberal part. They also support the economic imaginary around capitalism and in particular around neoliberalism. They actively consent to that kind of rule. They're not coerced, they're not co-opted, they largely agree with it. And why do they do so? It's because they justify the inequality. Remember Gramsci earlier about civil society and consent? How they appropriate certain cultural ideologies and assumptions to justify the inequality that's taken place. So they draw upon the discourse of meritocracy. You know, some people are just brighter and more skillful and have more talent, so they should be rewarded, shouldn't they? The argument goes. They're just inherently more clever people, hardworking. They draw upon the idea of moral individualism, that, you know, if through your hard work, determination, you can achieve almost like the American dream. We did have a couple of people talking about the American dream as a way of trying to explain this. And of course, we had some who talked about rewarding entrepreneurial creativity, flair, that's just, you know, randomly distributed in society. So these were some of the justifications I used, but also interestingly, what we found was how they also used other kinds of discourses as a way of trying to counter and deflect criticism of capitalism. The one that we didn't imagine until we got to the region was the one around the Kazakh famine of 1930-33, during how they saw it as Russian colonization. This came over again and again during our interviews, and we were wondering why is this being used? And it was in large part, it was a form of trying to delegitimize the Soviet Union. Because whilst after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had people who were only remembering what the Soviet Union brought about: greater education, greater housing, greater electrification of society. Clearly, the neoliberals sought to delegitimize those gains that occurred during the Soviet Union, and they sought to point out the atrocities that were committed under the name of Soviet Union, and they pointed in particular to the Kazakh famine of 1930-33. But they also used other kinds of discourses around state corruption. You know, capitalism would work wonderfully if it wasn't for the state, as if there's a magic formula for how the state should operate under capitalism. And then they also pointed out to political authoritarianism as a way of saying that we need greater governance structures, judicial reforms, political institutions that would ensure that the free market could then operate unhindered. Colleagues, I think we need to be critical about, whilst there's a lot to like about this movement, there's also things that we should be cause for our concern. Firstly, I think it's the notion of the word equality. All too often, it was restricted to cultural rights only. They showed, just like Adil in the quote above, showed very little concern for economic equality, substantive economic equality. It just wasn't their thing, right? As Adil says, you know, our paths do not cross. We just don't attend their rallies. And I think, secondly, is that when they do talk about democracy, the activists in this group, again, it's all too often limited just to the public sphere, the politics, as if economic democracy it's not of also importance. The ability of workers to have decision-making powers is just as much of a democratic right than that of citizens electing their rulers. Now, so hopefully that gives you an idea of the flavor of the characteristics of the neoliberal progressive movement. Now I'm going to go on to the other one. Again, as a way of introducing you to the other movement, I'll give you a case study here of the Astana Mothers Movement. Now, this particular movement emerged in 2019 after a Kokdo tragedy in which 5 children died in a basically a wooden shack because they had to leave. It was in winter, and they had to leave it was cold, and they left the heating on throughout the night, and then something called light, and the children died. Where were the parents, you may ask? Well, the parents were working, and they had to work in order to pay off their loans that they had accumulated in order to make ends meet. You know, they weren't; these were survival loans. They weren't luxury loans, and this triggered a citywide, but also a nationwide movement around greater support for vulnerable families, especially families that had a large number of children, and the lack of support that was given to families by the state. Now, interestingly, here for the activists in this movement, the home becomes the site of their concern, their moral concern. It's around health of their children's health care, their education, housing, and basic amenities like water and electricity. And for Gulnara, who was the leader of this particular movement, her vision of a good society was that of a strong welfare state. And the kind of alliances that she had were with kind of rather ambivalent, she had rather mixed relationships, I think, ambivalent ones, contradictory at times, with the nationalist movement, but also with the kind of conservative movements like the Union of Parents in Kazakhstan. 10 minutes, okay, great, thank you. Now, she kind of explains here the kind of reforms that the state needs to engage in order to ensure the well-being of her constituents, but also large part of the society, the working class, vulnerable families. So she says, people speak badly of us and say, no one told you to have so many children. Now take care of them and stop begging. But we are making a valuable contribution to society. Human capital is the most valuable resource. The state should practice socialism when it comes to large vulnerable families. At least healthcare and education must be free. Now, to kind of return this reformist defensive movement, because what they are engaging in is what Candioti famously called bargaining with patriarchy, in which activists adopt coping strategies and mechanisms of survival, where they know the rules of the game is to show loyalty and deference to authority in extract for some breadcrumbs, effectively, or some sort of greater distribution of resources. And that's what we see, right, in this bargaining with patriarchal structures. They reluctantly engage with it because they know it can achieve immediate results. So they demand greater welfare support for themselves, as well as asking for support around housing and the credit and debt. Now, the state often co-opts them and accommodates them because their demands, their claims are largely limited and can be easily met in terms of reforming or regulating the economy. But as in the case of Gulnara, if they start to demand too much, or their demands become too threatening to the economic system and the political system, then they get shut down. And in the case of Gulnara, sadly, that's exactly what happened to her. Her activism was curtailed as a result of her exposing the plight, exposing how the very rich lived, and this was seen as too threatening to the elites and the status quo. They were largely indifferent to LGBT and critical of liberal feminism, both partly because, or largely because, they were both seen as divorced from their immediate concern. It just didn't resonate, their concerns didn't resonate with them. But they were critical of international donors, mocked them for lacking sympathy for their plight. They had all sorts of euphemisms and framings of international donors, such as like Soros and USAID. But as I said, they largely were resigned to the capitalist structures and unable to really envisage an alternative economic system. And that's why it becomes a defensive mechanism, because they're seeking to defend whatever gains they have or to achieve some limited gain, but nothing more considerable than that. Then the third one that I want to give is this one here, that reflects a case study of an informal trade union of delivery workers in Almaty, it was organized by Timur, who opposed the corporation and exploitation of delivery workers. For my colleagues here, you will recognize the company, Volt, the Finnish tech giant, but also they were also against Globo as well, the Spanish company. And what they were trying to do was trying to ensure that they were properly paid by the corporations. What happened was that these corporations extracted rent from them, platform rent charges. Before it was something like 10%, then became 30%, and they found themselves struggling to survive as a result of this extraction of 30% from their income. This led to Timur organizing an informal trade union, in which involved galvanizing, mobilizing young rural migrants who were largely Kazakh speaking. And his main concern was trying to resist the exploitation by these corporate giants, whether it be Yandex, Volt, Glovo, or Google or Uber. And his vision of a good society was that of anarcho-communism, built around cooperative societies. And his allies were largely small leftist organizations. And he had some really interesting things to say during the interview. He explained how these delivery companies like Volt and Glovo had extracted and disempowered and impoverished a large number of workers. So he says, when Volt changed its paying system, it affected something like 8,000 workers. Because of our protest, this informal protest that occurred, 5,000 workers were able to retain their previous rate of payment. It makes me feel good that I helped 5,000 workers, so 5,000 working class men. I think about our small victory. I feel good about myself. On most days, it's darn difficult to feel like a full human being. And and it's probably worth here, colleagues, noting that after the protest, he was beaten up, we suspect by people linked to the state. And well, he definitely think it was correct to the state apparatus, having a radical who opposing the corporate companies in Kazakhstan. So he was beaten up, affected his jawline, had to have operation, racked up a huge medical bill, and sadly, his relationship with his girlfriend fragmented, and to the point that he kind of, sadly, was feeling quite suicidal. But he had enormous empathy for and a concern for groups, or for vulnerable groups, whoever they were. And I think you can see this in this quote here. Let's be honest, no one wants to be an activist for the working class people, because we are likely to end up dead. We pose a real threat. I support feminism and LGBT issues. I really admire and respect them. It takes guts to openly declare your sexuality in this country. I participated in many feminist marches to show that even very masculine and Kazakh-speaking men like me support feminism. Now, this form of movement, this understanding of social change, we labeled as radical transformative, because it sought to tackle the structural and institutional forms of cultural and economic domination, oppression, and inequality. It wasn't just one or the other, it was both. It wasn't just tackling cultural or economic, it was both together. That's why I think it's a transformation of society. And they advocated forms of communism or corporatism as an alternative to capitalism. Their notion of equality, democracy, and representation was much more broader than those that are taken by human rights activists in the country. And in some cases, because of the lack of trying to educate themselves into an alternative vision of society to that of capitalism, they had to educate themselves. And in doing so, they organized reading groups, cultural activities to strengthen and expand their membership. And they drew upon Marxist reading groups in Russia or Russian YouTube channels to help them to understand what is the alternative, or is there no alternative. And I think what comes out here is the strong kind of counter movement to the neoliberal hegemony. I know I'm running out. If I can just have another 5 minutes, and then because then I can go on to the fourth movement, and I'll be very brief on this one. Largely ethno-nationalist, Islamist groups, very similar to the kind of work that Echat did on the slow anti-Americanism. They drew upon conspiracy theories and hypocrisy about democracy, US democracy, as a way of galvanizing support around their issues. And they're highlighted here. You can see here there's highlighting on victims of in Syria, Iraq, showing, well, how come the world has forgotten this part of the world when attention is given to other parts of the world? So they were trying to bring out, I think, the kind of the racist, at times racist assumption about global assistance. They were rather critical of international organizations, and they often allied themselves with conservative religious groups. And I won't necessarily read out the whole quote here, but I think what you get from Marat, who was an activist in Astana, who represented one of these ethno-nationalist groups, was the kind of the sense that they felt that the West were imposing their ideas upon them, and it was kind of almost engaging in this kind of cultural war, but at the same time, kind of contradictorily adopting neoliberalism, but yet reacting against some of the cultural values. Hence why we then label this as neoliberal reactionary movement. Reactionary, the cultural war side, reactionary against cultural liberalism, but adopting very much the neoliberal dimensions. Again, instrumentalizing culture wars and conspiracy theories to oppose cultural liberalism, largely adopting and largely supporting capitalist institutions and justifying inequality. Highly media savvy in promoting their ideas. And finally, if I can then just end on this slide here, just to kind of more or less just some last points on this, kind of some takeaway points, as it were. I think there are a couple of things that emerge as a result of our study here. Firstly, the extent to which most participants supported or were resigned to capitalism. I think again, this shouldn't be too much of a surprise to colleagues familiar with political economy and sociology about the sense of resignation that people feel. But there were activism, but activism all too often tended to be around cultural issues, changing cultural structures and norms. And I think what's noticeable about this is that you can demand changes to cultural institutions and norms without changing capitalism. It doesn't do anything. You can change the people, but if the positions are the same, you still got the same rotten deal, right? Doesn't matter who my employer may be, of any sexuality or gender, but if he or she is still, or they are still exploiting me, then clearly I'm in no better position. Which then gives rise to an important slogan: no recognition without redistribution. I think the other point that also comes out from our study is the extent to which Western donors supported the neoliberal progressive movement. That was, and again, I suppose if we want to see things about global hegemony, one can probably understand why those movements were given more aid or assistance than, let's say, the radical transformative movement. The lack of grand alliance with the working class and progressive movements, that was again a surprise to us. We suspected before we went to the field that we would find this coalition, this alliance against the elites. Largely, social struggles were fragmented and individualized. And I suppose, again, this shouldn't be too much of a surprise, given that last year we wrote the book Frontier Capitalism. We did find support for evidence that, after 30 years of neoliberalization in the region, that we find neoliberal hegemony in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Thank you.